The year is 1944, and the war in Europe is turning decisively against the German Reich. The skies over the fatherland are choked with the incessant drone of Allied bombers. Day after day, the air superiority promised to the German people is systematically eroded. In this moment of desperate necessity, a radical solution was conceived, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet. It was not merely an aircraft, it was a defiant statement of advanced engineering. Its profile was unlike anything else in the air, a sleek, stubby-winged dart without a propeller. The Comet was a pure rocket fighter, a machine designed to soar into the stratosphere with terrifying acceleration. German High Command believed this single weapon could fundamentally alter the course of the air war. Propaganda quickly elevated the rocket plane to mythic status, hailing it as the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon. It promised speeds that Allied interceptors could not hope to match, making it seemingly invulnerable. Its planned operational altitude placed it far above the escort fighters, giving it a critical advantage. The vision was clear: a phalanx of these rocket interceptors would tear through the bomber formations. They would be invincible, a lethal answer to the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Allies. Engineers and pilots were swept up in a fever of creation and expectation for this revolutionary design. They saw it as the peak of aerodynamic science, a leap into the jet and rocket age. The very concept of a liquid-fueled rocket blasting a pilot to combat altitude was exhilarating. The speed offered a psychological edge, a feeling of untouchable power over the enemy. This aircraft represented the ultimate expression of Nazi Germany's final, desperate technological gambit. It was a dream of decisive victory, a hope held aloft by volatile chemicals and daring design. The pressure to deploy the Comet quickly became immense, overriding safety concerns and thorough testing. The promise of invincibility blinded many to the inherent, catastrophic flaws lurking within the design. The Comet was rushed into production, a symbol of hope and, ultimately, a tragic monument to technological hubris. The dream of the invincible fighter was about to collide violently with the harsh realities of chemistry and physics. The true genesis of the Comet lies not in Messerschmitt's factories but in the quiet, focused work of brilliant rocket scientists. The story begins in the 1930s with Alexander Lippisch, a pioneer in tailless aircraft design. Lippisch's work on gliders eventually merged with the propulsion research being conducted by Helmuth Walter. Walter was the true alchemist of the Comet, developing the high-thrust liquid-fueled rocket motor. His HWK 109-509 rocket engine was the heart of the miracle, a terrifyingly powerful and complex machine. This engine required a specific and highly energetic mixture of propellants to achieve its phenomenal thrust. The engine concept was radically new, bypassing the need for air intake and conventional combustion entirely. It relied on the hypergolic reaction of two distinct chemical agents, designed to ignite spontaneously upon contact. This instant ignition was the source of the Comet's blinding speed, launching it like a massive artillery shell. The airframe, based on Lippisch's elegant delta-wing designs, was stripped down to the bare minimum. It was essentially a manned missile, designed for a single, brief, and violent interception run. The Me-163 was built for pure acceleration and climb rate, sacrificing endurance for raw performance. Its flight time was measured in mere minutes, a consequence of the enormous fuel consumption rate. The design was a masterpiece of compromise, a machine pushed to the absolute edge of contemporary materials science. It demanded entirely new manufacturing techniques and unprecedented levels of precision in its assembly. Every component, from the pressure valves to the combustion chamber, had to withstand extreme thermal and mechanical stress. The entire fuselage was a highly pressurized, fragile bomb wrapped around the pilot's seat. Early prototypes, stripped of armament, demonstrated incredible performance, breaking speed records. Test pilots described the acceleration as brutal and exhilarating, a force that pinned them deep into their seats. The successful tests fueled the feverish belief that this technology was unstoppable and foolproof. The initial successes masked a host of problems that would later plague the operational units. The very nature of its power source made the Comet a beautiful, but inherently dangerous, weapon. The destructive beauty of the Comet was entirely reliant on its volatile and corrosive hypergolic fuels. The main propellants were designated T-Stoff and C-Stoff, euphemistic names for terrifying chemicals. T-Stoff was a concentrated hydrogen peroxide solution, a powerful oxidizer that released immense heat when catalyzed. C-Stoff, the second component, was a mixture primarily composed of hydrazine hydrate and methyl alcohol, serving as the fuel. The magic and the danger lay in their combination. A mere drop of C-Stoff on T-Stoff caused instant, explosive combustion. This hypergolic reaction eliminated the need for a complex ignition system, simplifying the engine design. However, the chemical nature of both substances presented unparalleled logistical and safety nightmares. T-Stoff was violently corrosive, capable of dissolving human flesh and conventional storage materials. Ground crews had to wear cumbersome, fully enclosed, rubberized protective suits resembling those for deep-sea diving. Even a small spill during the lengthy and precarious fueling process could prove fatal to the technician. The fuel tanks themselves were an issue, often leaking or suffering corrosion from the aggressive T-Stoff. Contamination was an ever-present danger. Any trace of a foreign substance could trigger an uncontrolled reaction. The fueling procedure was a slow, deliberate dance of death, performed under the immense pressure of wartime urgency. Aircraft could take hours to safely load the required propellants, a process requiring utmost concentration and precision. The pilots were literally seated between two highly unstable, powerful chemical bombs during flight. The lines carrying the propellants were placed in close proximity, a necessary risk due to the aircraft's compact design. The pilots understood that their rocket fighter was inherently unstable, a machine built on the edge of explosion. The toxic fumes from the engines were also a major health hazard, both on the ground and in the air. This extreme dependence on hypergolic fuel was both the Comet's greatest strength and its terminal weakness. The invincibility of the fighter was constantly undermined by the instability of its own propellant system. The Comet's experimental phase was marked by both breathtaking success and terrifying, unexpected failures. Initial testing began with unpowered glider flights to prove the stability of the tailless design. Once the airframe was confirmed, the Walter rocket engine was integrated for powered trials. The first powered flights were revolutionary, demonstrating unparalleled rates of climb and acceleration. Test pilots reported ascending to 30,000 feet in mere minutes, an unheard-of performance in the early 1940s. In 1941, the prototype Me-163A, flown by Heine Dittmar, unofficially broke the world airspeed record. The raw power of the HWK engine was exhilarating, pushing the envelope of human flight capabilities. However, the high-speed flights also revealed significant problems with control stability at transonic speeds. The flight envelope was extremely unforgiving, demanding absolute precision from the pilots. the transition from powered flight to gliding was abrupt, requiring perfect judgment for a safe return. More ominously, early incidents began to showcase the catastrophic nature of the fuel system failures. A sudden, unexpected engine shutdown often led to violent shaking or control loss, severely testing the pilot's skill. The most terrifying accidents involved propellants mixing outside the combustion chamber. One notorious incident saw a pilot survive a crash, only to be killed when a small pool of residual T-stuff spontaneously combusted. These early explosions, though rare, were absolute and total, leaving little but wreckage and ash. The engineering team struggled to contain the unpredictable nature of the hypergolic fluids under various stresses. Vibrations, G-forces, and temperature changes all played a role in compromising the fragile fuel lines. Every test flight was a calculated risk, a gamble against the inherent volatility built into the aircraft. The successes were celebrated loudly, but the accidents were often minimized or buried under wartime secrecy. The sheer potential of the rocket fighter continued to overshadow the growing casualty list in the test program. The untamed power was a double-edged sword, promising salvation while simultaneously delivering destruction. By the middle of the war, the Luftwaffe's once vaunted fighter arm was stretched to the breaking point. The continuous attrition against Allied air superiority was becoming unsustainable, especially on the Western Front. Every major German city and industrial center was now within range of the massive bomber streams. Senior commanders, including men like General Gauland, openly admitted the desperate need for a game-changer. The Me-163 Comet arrived in this atmosphere of despair, holding the promise of technological salvation. It was seen as the perfect interceptor, fast enough to evade Allied escort fighters and climb rapidly above the bombers. The idea was that its sudden, rapid attacks would sow panic and chaos in the tightly packed bomber formations. This disruption was believed to be more effective than continuous engagement by conventional piston-engine fighters. The Comet was rushed from the experimental airfields directly into operational service in 1944. Pilot training was compressed, often dangerously so, due to the urgent need for defense. Squadrons were formed and designated to protect key targets, such as the vital synthetic fuel plants. The initial encounters were electrifying, with Comet pilots executing spectacular high-speed passes. Allied pilots were stunned by the sheer velocity of the new German fighter, which seemed to appear from nowhere. For a brief time, the Comet delivered on its promise, becoming a genuine threat and psychological terror. The hope within the Luftwaffe command was palpable. Perhaps this was the turning point they had awaited. However, the tactical reality was far less glorious than the strategists had envisioned. The Comet's incredibly short flight duration meant it could only make one or maybe two quick-firing passes. Reloading and refueling the temperamental aircraft took substantial time, nullifying its rapid deployment advantage. Despite the desperate need for a victory, the Comet's operational successes remained frustratingly limited. The weapon of last resort was deployed with a fervent hope that tragically ignored its deep-seated flaws. The inherent danger of the Me-163 transitioned from the testing fields to the operational squadrons with horrific consequences. The most catastrophic failures frequently occurred during the critical moments of takeoff and landing. The initial design utilized a jettisonable wheel dolly for takeoff, which was dropped immediately after liftoff. The aircraft would then rely on a retractable landing skid for its final return to the airfield. This decision was made to save weight and simplify the aerodynamic shape of the tiny aircraft. However, the jettisoning of the heavy dolly caused severe vibration and often ruptured the plumbing of the fuel lines. Any subsequent leakage of the highly volatile T-stoff and C-stoff could mix and ignite, often with devastating effect. The first operational explosions were terrifying spectacles of white-hot chemical fire on the runway. These fires were not the slow, oily burn of aviation gasoline but instantaneous, corrosive detonations. Pilots were either killed instantly or horribly burned by the corrosive nature of the propellants. One common and lethal accident occurred during the landing phase itself after the rocket motor was exhausted. The forward-mounted skid, upon touchdown, would often jar the aircraft violently on the uneven airfields. This impact caused the residual, unburnt propellants to slosh violently in their tanks, fracturing internal lines. A ruptured fuel line combined with the heat of the landing skid or the remaining engine heat spelled disaster. The result was a blinding flash, a chemical explosion that vaporized the rear section of the fuselage. These accidents were tragically referred to by ground crews as the comet's kiss of death. The sheer number of non-combat operational losses began to rapidly deplete the already small Comet fleet. The promise of invincibility was being mocked by the airplane's tendency to destroy itself before engaging the enemy. The initial fear the Allies felt for the rocket fighter was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating assessment of its weaknesses. The Comet proved to be almost as dangerous to its own pilots and ground crew as it was to the enemy. The moment of truth for every Comet flight was not the interception but the harrowing, powerless return to Earth. Once the mere 8 minutes of powered flight were exhausted, the Mi-163 transformed instantly into a high-speed glider. The pilots had to manage a steep glide path from extreme altitude, aiming for a single, perfect landing attempt. There was absolutely no possibility of a second approach or a go-around once the speed was bled off. The aircraft's wing loading and glide characteristics made it notoriously difficult to handle at lower speeds. The final approach was made on a single, fixed, central wooden skid and two small, retractable wing skid wheels. The skid was a poor substitute for a proper undercarriage, designed for smooth, concrete runways. However, many German airfields were poorly maintained or had been damaged by Allied bombing, making the surfaces rough. The jolt of the skid contacting an uneven surface was a violent shockwave transmitted through the fragile airframe. This impact was the frequent trigger for the aforementioned fatal ruptures in the fuel plumbing system. Residual, unspent T-stoff and C-stoff, still pressurized in the lines, would meet and explode on the tarmac. Furthermore, the lack of traditional wheels meant the pilot had no control over the direction of the aircraft once it touched down. The Comet would slide helplessly until it lost all momentum, often veering widely off the runway. This uncontrolled slide sometimes sent the aircraft skidding into prepared trenches or other obstacles. The pilot, trapped inside the cockpit, was completely at the mercy of the momentum and the ground friction. Allied fighter pilots quickly learned to circle the airfields, waiting for the defenseless Comet to glide in. The landing phase made the Invincible fighter a sitting duck, vulnerable to any strafing attack. Many Comet pilots were shot down not while fighting, but while desperately trying to bring their glider safely home. The designers had prioritized speed and climb rate so completely that they made the final few minutes of flight the most dangerous. The landing procedure was an unforgiving, terrifying, and often deadly conclusion to a breathtaking flight. The young men chosen to fly the Mi-163 were among the Luftwaffe's most skilled and courageous volunteers. They understood the inherent, existential risk of strapping themselves into a fuselage filled with volatile, explosive propellants. These pilots were required to possess a rare combination of exceptional piloting skill and steely psychological resilience. Their training emphasized the absolute necessity of precision, especially during the brief, high-energy combat phase. The G-forces experienced during the comet's acceleration were immense, testing the limits of human endurance. The cockpit was extremely cramped, offering poor visibility during the critical gliding and landing phase. Pilots often suffered from the noxious fumes of the unburnt C-stop and T-stop, even with the best ventilation. The isolation of the solo high-altitude interception runs added to the mental strain of the mission. They knew that their flight suit was the only barrier between them and the immediate, deadly threat of chemical corrosion. The constant specter of a chemical fire upon landing weighed heavily on the minds of every Comet pilot. There was a silent understanding among the Comet airmen that a safe return was never guaranteed by their skill alone. They faced a higher rate of death from operational accidents than from actual combat with the enemy. The losses during training and landing were a grim secret kept from the wider German populace. These casualties represented a significant silent sacrifice made to a weapon that consistently undermined its own pilots. The psychological toll of flying the Comet contributed to a climate of fatalism within the small rocket fighter units. Pilots were heroes and pioneers, yet they were also involuntary martyrs to a flawed technological vision. Their quiet dedication to duty, despite the overwhelming risk, speaks to the immense desperation of the late war effort. The bravery was unquestionable, but the cost, in both lives and morale, was unbearably high. Every successful landing was met not with cheers, but with a collective, quiet sigh of relief from the ground crew. The Comet pilots were true pioneers of rocket-powered flight, achieving great feats at a terrible personal price. The initial shock of encountering the lightning-fast Mi-163 quickly gave way to a tactical, organized response by the Allies. The sheer speed of the Comet meant that traditional pursuit and dogfighting were completely impossible. However, Allied intelligence soon gathered accurate information regarding the Comet's fundamental weaknesses. They quickly understood the limited fuel endurance, the perilous landing procedure, and the airfield vulnerability. The primary tactic developed by the Allies was simply to wait for the rocket fighter to run out of propellants. Allied escort fighters, particularly the versatile P-51 Mustang, were instructed to avoid chasing the powered Comet. Instead, they began orbiting the known Comet airfields, waiting for the moment the aircraft became a powerless glider. The landing Comet was a defenseless, slow-moving target, often veering wildly due to its skid. This tactic proved devastatingly effective, leading to a significant spike in Comet losses during the landing phase. Furthermore, Allied ground attack aircraft began prioritizing the bombing and strafing of the Comet airfields themselves. These attacks targeted the vital infrastructure, including the sensitive fuel storage bunkers and the transport vehicles. Destroying the highly specialized fueling equipment was an effective way to ground the entire Comet fleet. The logistical nightmare of handling the hypergolic propellants made the airfields extremely vulnerable to disruption. Allied airmen also quickly learned to avoid the tail of the Comet during its powered ascent. The Comet's own rocket wash was a danger, and the Allied pilots sought to engage only in head-on passes. The concentrated firepower of the heavy bomber formations proved sufficient to absorb the Comet's brief attack. Often, the Comet would manage only a single destructive pass before its fuel was entirely depleted. The Allied response was a masterclass in exploiting an opponent's technological overreach and design flaws. They demonstrated that overwhelming force and superior tactics could defeat the promise of a miracle weapon. The invincibility that Germany had dreamed of was systematically countered by patience and targeted aggression. Beyond the fuel's volatility, the Comet suffered from a confluence of critical and often overlooked technical flaws. The jettisonable takeoff dolly, while novel, proved to be an engineering decision with disastrous consequences. When the dolly detached, its jarring separation could easily disrupt the delicate balance of the internal fuel system. The movement also created the risk of the heavy wheel assembly bouncing back up and striking the fuselage. A strike to the undercarriage bay could rupture the sensitive piping that carried the two propellants. Another major flaw was the poor design of the main landing skid and its impact on the internal plumbing. The pressure of the rough landing was directly transmitted to the airframe, causing hairline fractures in the system. Even a small crack allowed the hypergolic propellants to mingle outside the safety of the combustion chamber. The fuel pumps themselves were extremely complex and often failed under the immense stresses of rocket flight. Engine reliability was a persistent issue, leading to unpredictable flameouts at critical, high-altitude moments. The Comet also suffered from inadequate armament for its intended role as a rapid interceptor. Its guns, primarily the 108 Malawian Quachas 30mm cannon, had a low muzzle velocity and a very small ammunition supply. The rapid closing speed of the Comet meant the pilot had less than 2 seconds to effectively aim and fire. A small window of firing time combined with limited ammunition severely restricted the aircraft's combat effectiveness. The pilots struggled to adjust to the firing dynamics, often passing through the bomber formation before they could hit. The entire airframe was a composite of lightweight materials, designed for speed over durability. Even minor combat damage could lead to catastrophic structural failure or control loss. The technical shortcomings were not minor inconveniences but fundamental limitations of the desperate design. These flaws turned the Comet from a feared weapon into a liability for the few pilots who flew it. The very speed and power that made it a miracle also amplified the consequences of its design deficiencies. The operational life of the Mi-163 was continuously throttled by the overwhelming and unique logistical challenges it presented. Its reliance on the two hypergolic propellants created a supply chain that was fragile and easily disrupted. T-STOF and C-STOF were not standard aviation fuels, they required specialized production facilities and unique transport methods. The propellants were manufactured in separate locations, demanding a complex and risky system of coordinated transit. The chemicals had to be moved in dedicated glass-lined or high-grade aluminum rail cars and containers. The slightest contamination en route could lead to a catastrophic explosion, destroying vital rail lines and materials. Specialized tank wagons and pumps were needed at the airfields, all of which were vulnerable to Allied bombing. Ground crew required extensive, highly specialized training just to safely handle the fueling operation. The time required to safely fuel one Comet was disproportionate to its short operational flight time. A single day of Comet sorties could consume enormous resources that were increasingly scarce in late-war Germany. The scarcity of both the propellants and the skilled personnel severely limited the number of aircraft that could be deployed at any one time. Even when aircraft were available, they were often grounded for lack of sufficient, uncontaminated T-STOF or C-STOF. The necessary protective gear for the ground crews was also a finite resource, requiring careful maintenance and replacement. The Allied realization of this dependency led to a deliberate targeting of the German chemical industry. Bombing raids on synthetic fuel and chemical plants effectively starved the Comet units of their lifeblood. The rocket fighter was a brilliant piece of engineering, but it was practically useless without its difficult supply chain. The logistical tail proved to be the Comet's ultimate undoing, a silent, pervasive enemy the aircraft could not outrun. The ambitious technological leap of the Comet was simply too resource-intensive for a nation fighting a losing war. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, despite its brief and troubled service history, left an indelible mark on aviation. It was the first and only rocket-powered fighter aircraft ever to become fully operational in combat. Its astonishing performance proved the viability of high-thrust liquid-fuel rocket propulsion for manned flight. The Comet's blistering speed and vertical climb rate foreshadowed the performance of post-war jet and rocket interceptors. Its radical tailless design, championed by Lippisch, influenced subsequent high-speed, delta-wing aircraft development. Elements of its rocket engine technology were studied and adapted by the Allied powers after the war's conclusion. The captured aircraft and technical data contributed significantly to early rocket and missile programs in both the East and West. However, the Comet's primary legacy is equally tied to its catastrophic operational failures and high casualty rate. It serves as a stark historical warning against prioritizing performance over fundamental safety and logistical practicality. The tragic explosions on takeoff and landing became the defining, horrifying characteristic of its service. These accidents underscored the lethal risk of using hypergolic propellants within a fragile, compact fighter airframe. The very name Comet is now synonymous with brilliant, desperate engineering that self-destructed. It remains a potent symbol of German technological genius during the war's end, tainted by a dark streak of unreliability. The pilots who flew it are remembered for their extraordinary courage in the face of two enemies, the Allies and their own aircraft. The ultimate failure of the Comet was not in its conception but in its practical, operational execution under duress. It was a machine that demanded absolute perfection, which wartime conditions could never provide. The dream of the Invincible fighter ended not in a blaze of glory over the Rhine, but in a series of horrific chemical fires on the ground. Today, the preserved Comets in museums stand as a powerful reminder of the cutting edge and the terrible cost of extreme innovation.